This weekend's military action against Iran by the United States and Israel again raises some fundamental questions about when nation states should go to war. Under what conditions should they go to war, if they should ever go to war? It raises the questions of just war theory, an important theory within the Christian faith. Welcome to a bonus episode of Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. I'm Terrance Carroll, an ordained Baptist preacher, public theologian, lawyer, and former Speaker of the Colorado House of Representatives. Faithful Witness is rooted in the prophetic witness of the Black church, and each week we explore the moral questions that shape our democracy, culture, and society. Thanks for watching. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe, share, and like. For those of us who call ourselves Christian, anytime our nation goes to war, it poses some fundamental questions and challenges about whether or not we should support our country going to war. Under what conditions should we support our nation going to war? These are the fundamental questions of just war theory. And I should actually be more precise. The questions underlying just war theory lie in a polemic. The polemic is this. As Christians, most of us generally recognize that theologically, war is not an optimal situation. In fact, the notion of war, the notion of violence, is fundamentally at odds with the fact that we follow the Prince of Peace. War is a fundamental failure in society and our moral and our ethics and how we interact with each other, both individually and writ large as nation states. War, violence of any sort, is a failure, not something to be celebrated. On the other hand of this polemic, though, is this realism represented by the Niebuhr brothers and others, that there are times when nation states must go to war, even if reluctantly, nation states have to go to war. And this is where the notion of just war theory comes from. It's not a new theory. In fact, the father of just war theory is considered to be Augustine of Hippo. He started developing the pieces of what would eventually become just war theory around the 5th century. And central to Augustine's notion of just war is that going to war, engaging in military conflict, has to be an act of last resort after all other alternatives have failed. And in fact, war should not be based on vengeance. War should not be based on ego. According to Augustine, war has to be based on this notion that it's intended to bring peace and restore a just order. And war should never be entered into lightly. It should be something that you think long and hard about. It should be something where there's gnashing of teeth, where you have to be dragged, kicked, and screaming into war. That's the basis of just war theory. It's not something you go into lightly. It's something you go into with your eyes wide open, and it's something you go into because you're trying to restore order within a society that has been knocked out of equilibrium because one nation state has acted by attacking another nation state, by acting violently toward its own people. These are some of the basic elements of when war could be considered just within Christian teaching. And I should add, not all Christians believe in this notion of just war. I mean, there's some folks like the great Stanley Hauerwas who would argue that there are no conditions that a nation state should ever go to war because we bastardized just war theory. We have made just war theory, in his estimation, a checklist of things that if we can check off all these things, then it's appropriate for us to go to war. I agree with Stanley Hauerwas that the notion of just war, if there is such a thing, should inspire us to engage in deep theological reflection about the reasons for going to war. It should not just be because we're trying to be good patriotic citizens or we like the president. We should think deeply about whether the war is just. We should think deeply about whether we are doing the right thing biblically and theologically. We should think deeply about what war does to our Christian witness. And this is what Aquinas eventually gets to in his great theological work, Summa Theologica, when he starts first articulating in a very systematic and legalistic way with the undercurrent of strong theological reflection what the elements of just war are and what's required for us to engage in just war. There are three elements to just war that we have to think about as Aquinas articulates them in Summa Theologica. One is the act of going to war the right thing? The second part is our conduct during the war just? And then the third part of it is, how do we conduct ourselves after the war? How do we conduct the peace? All three things have to be considered when we try to articulate whether a war is just or not from the Christian perspective. And I am going to get around to what does this look like for what we're talking about in regards to what's going on in Iran right now. But I wanted to make sure that we level set and that I lay out common language and a common understanding for all of us so that when we're talking about, and we're kind of in a dialogue, I like to think we're in a dialogue, even though this is a video where I'm talking and you're listening, but in a lot of regards, this is a dialogue because I hope that after you watch this video that you sit down and reflect on your own what you think about what's going on in Iran. How do you view what's going on in Iran based on these principles of just war theory as I will lay them out? And I hope that you go back on your own and read a little bit about just war and understand historically how the Christian church, the various and vast and disparate traditions of the Christian church have thought about just war and if nation states should engage in war whatsoever. And a bit of a spoiler alert, I tend to fall on the side of being a pacifist. Although I'm not a complete pacifist, I do think there are times when violence is justified, when war is likely justified, and I do borrow heavily from just war theory. But I should let you know that the times that I think that war is justified is exceptionally limited in scope. So let's briefly run through these three components and what the elements are of these three components of just war theory. The first one in Latin is called jus ad bellum, the justice of going to war. And there are 5 or 6 elements involved in this, and I wrote them down because I don't know if anyone really knows them off the top of their head, but I wanted to make sure that I was very precise in how I talked about these things with you all on this particular bonus episode of Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. There's some questions that have to be asked about just war. The first element, is it a just cause? And that means, is it self-defense or in defense of the innocent against aggression? The second part of it is, does the person engaging in war have legitimate authority to engage in that war? And that's an important question in a democracy. What is legitimate authority? In the United States, for us to embark upon military action, to embark upon a war, it requires congressional approval for us to go to war or to conduct military action that's not in self-defense. Preemptive military strikes are generally not considered to be something that the president can unilaterally engage in. Even in the aftermath of 9/11, President Bush consulted Congress and sought congressional approval before taking action against Iraq and Afghanistan. Does the president have unilateral authority to embark upon war? That's another question. And then, do you have right intention? It's not simply that it's just, but are you going into this with the right intention? Or is this merely an act of vengeance? Is this merely to stroke your ego? Is this some type of massive flex? Is this because you've had a long running disagreement with another power? Is this something that is conceived of in the Christian sense, as we would say it as Christians, from the purity of heart? And I realize that's a loaded term right now. The next thing is this the last resort? Have all other nonviolent options been exhausted? In the days leading up to this, there was, in fact, a great deal of diplomacy going on between the United States and Iran over its nuclear program, which raises the question of, is a nuclear program even a reason to go to war, especially when our government said back in June that we had significantly crippled, if not eliminated, Iran's nuclear war program. So we should put that out there. Next is probability of success, and then proportionality. Does the anticipated good outweigh the harm? What are the scales? Are they balanced on this toward the good more than toward the bad? And then the next component of just war theory is jus in bello. It's the conduct of the war, moral and ethical. And there are two things that are part of this theory. Are you distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants? Are you trying to minimize and mitigate against harm toward non-combatants? This notion of avoiding harm and mitigating harm against civilian populations, non-combatants, became important in the aftermath of World War II, where civilians, non-combatants, became significant targets of air raids on all sides. Initially, the Germans against Great Britain, and then Great Britain and the United States against Germany and against the other Axis powers. And we saw what happened with the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where civilian populations were intentionally targeted for harm. That would have been a violation, and I still consider that a violation of that component of just war theory. And then the second part of the justice and the conduct of the war is whether it's proportional, not using more force than necessary to achieve the means of the just war. And then the last part of it is jus post bellum. How do you achieve the peace? In other words, when you go into war, it's just as important to think about what happens in the aftermath of the war. You can't go into war with just hopes and prayers. You have to think about the plan for peace. Is there a reconciliation after it? And are you treating your former enemy with justice and grace and mercy, or do you intend to treat them with humiliation? Think about what happened to Germany after World War I with the Versailles Peace Treaty, where Germany was humiliated, which laid the groundwork for the rise of Adolf Hitler, because so many people in Germany felt like they had been mistreated and humiliated. And then by the time that Hitler rose to power, there were many in Germany who felt like they had to get their just rewards against France. And that's exactly what Hitler did when France capitulated. Hitler humiliated them in the peace. And then the last part of it is, are people going to be held accountable for any war crimes that are committed during the conduct of the war? And that's not just the losers, it's the winners as well as the losers. Anyone who engages in war crimes should be held accountable in the aftermath of the war. So these things raise some significant tensions for the Christian as we look at what's happening in Iran. Are we truly engaging in a just war, or is this a vanity project? Is this a war of choice? And we already hear folks on both sides of the aisle saying this is a war of choice that we did not have to engage in. We did not have to conduct military operations against Iran at this point, especially considering the United States was involved in diplomatic talks with Iran, mediated by a third party, up until the day before the attacks happened, the bombings by Israel and the United States. In fact, the third party mediator, I believe Oman, said that all parties were close to coming to some type of resolution that would have avoided this current conflict. The president has said that we are engaged in this war, this military action, because we want to bring regime change. He gave all the talk about Iran's nuclear capabilities and how we want to eliminate their nuclear capabilities, their ability to launch nuclear attacks against their neighbors, against Israel. And we have to ask ourselves, is that sufficient enough to justify going to war when we've previously have said that we eliminated their nuclear capabilities? And when allegedly they've had these nuclear capabilities for years and years and years, and yet they have not used them. And I want to pause here for a second and to be clear that I believe that internationally, Iran is a bad actor. I believe that Iran is a fascist, theologically fascist and authoritarian government. That the Khamenei regime, and apparently now he's passed on, but it doesn't matter. The regime from the first Ayatollah Khomeini till now has been a theo-fascist regime bent on imposing its will on its neighbors, both Muslim, Israel, and otherwise. But should we have engaged in this war, in this military action right here, right now? Was there a fierce urgency of now that required military action at this particular point in history? That's a question that remains unanswered. That's a question that will be the subject of much debate over the coming days and coming months. And historians will look at that question in the years to come to determine whether this was a just war. if it was necessary for the United States to act right now. And so the next part of this is, what were the intentions of our government? Our president, again, has said that this was really about the nuclear program. And then the president said, well, I want to have regime change. And then the president reposted on Truth Social that we had to go to war. It was someone else's post, but he reposted it, that said this war was necessary because Iran was engaged in manipulating our elections in 2020 and 2016 in an attempt to interfere in our elections in 2024. And I want to get into some deeper issues directly related to who we are as Christians and how we look at this as Christians. Because there will be some in the Christian faith who will wholeheartedly embrace this because they want to be viewed as good patriotic Americans. They've merged their Christianity into their patriotism to the point where they are incapable of critiquing this administration on biblical and theological grounds to determine if this administration is acting in a just, moral, and ethical manner. And that is a problem, because if we are to be the salt of the world, if we are to be the light in this world, there has to be sufficient, in fact, more than sufficient space between us and the government if we are to be a prophetic witness, if we are to be witnesses of Christ. We cannot be engaged in simply rubber stamping the acts of government, the acts of the administration, not just the Trump administration. Even if this were an Obama administration or a Biden administration or any other Democratic administration, there's an obligation of people of faith to be able to prophetically and critically engage theologically when the government chooses to use military force anywhere in the world under any circumstances, even if it's for a cause that we like. For instance, defending oppressed people in Iran, or potentially creating space for the Venezuelan people to create a democracy, or protecting Christians and others in Nigeria from terrorism. It doesn't matter if we personally like it. The question is it morally and ethically right to do, apart from our personal feelings about who the aggrieved group is or what administration happens to be in power at the time the military action is contemplated? And then the next thing I invite us to think about is there such a thing as a default Christian position on whether we go to war or not? What is our baseline when it comes to war and violence, or state-sanctioned violence? And maybe that's the better way to put it. How critical should we be when it comes to state-sanctioned violence of any type? I argue that we should be hypercritical of any state-sanctioned violence, no matter who the administration is and no matter who the target of that state-sanctioned violence is. I ask us to remember that our Lord Jesus Christ was the target and recipient of state-sanctioned violence. He died because of state-sanctioned violence. And so we should think about that. Think about the abuses, the easy abuses of state-sanctioned violence, especially when those of us who call ourselves Christians, people of faith, become incapable of criticizing the state and holding the state accountable for state-sanctioned violence because we become too intermingled with the powers that be. Again, think about the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ. The people of faith in Jerusalem are the ones that encourage Pilate to put Jesus on the cross. It's no coincidence, I think, that we're having this discussion in the lead up to Easter, in the lead up to that moment in time where Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. This is no coincidence that we have to ask ourselves questions about state-sanctioned violence and whether state-sanctioned violence is ever something that we can support as Christians. What does it mean to love our enemies when we're now in conflict with our enemies in a very significant way, with bombs and missiles flying both sides, with folks dying on both sides? This is not a question to be pondered casually. This is something, again, that requires deep theological reflection from us as to what do we mean when we say that we love our enemies, when yet we find ourselves in conflict with our enemies. Because it's a non-negotiable for us to love our enemies, at least how it's presented in the gospel. So how's that square up? For me, I think in a world where state-sanctioned violence is almost inevitable, I mean, I would like to think that state-sanctioned violence is rare, but war, as long as we live in a fallen world, war and violence is inevitable. So if war and violence is inevitable, loving our neighbor takes on a peculiar meaning. And I propose that that peculiar meaning means, back to just war theory earlier, that before we choose to engage in state-sanctioned violence, before we choose to engage in war, we have to exhaust all means and all methods to avoid war before engaging in violence of any sort against our neighbor. I don't think I'll ever get to the point. In fact, I know that I'll never get to the point where I will ever be okay with violence of any sort. I know I live in a world where violence happens. In fact, I was a police officer, so I've engaged in state violence, and I was never okay with it. I was always reluctant to engage in violence of any sort. In fact, Thomas Aquinas says that those who are entrusted with the use of violence, who have the authority to engage in state-sanctioned violence, have to be mournful warriors. And by mournful warriors, he means that we should be dragging our feet, kicking and screaming on the way to engage in war. We should be unhappy that we reach the point where we're engaged in violence against someone else. It should break our heart and cause us to rent our clothes and put sackcloth on our body and put ashes on the top of our heads because we've gotten to the point that we're engaging in war. It should not be a point of glee. And I watched a video of Senator Lindsey Graham, and it almost seemed that Lindsey Graham was gleeful that we were attacking Iran. You should take a look for yourself right here.
Moving forward, in a social media post Sunday, President Trump wrote this, quote, "Hopefully the IRGC and police will peacefully merge with the Iranian patriots and work together as a unit to bring back the country to the greatness it deserves." Is hope the plan for the future of Iran?
No, the future of Iran is going to be determined by the Iranian people. The new Iran, whatever it is, whether it's a cleric or a representative democracy, our goal is to make sure it cannot become, again, the largest state sponsor of terrorism. That's a win for us.
But is there a plan to make sure that happens, Senator? Is there a plan? Does the president have a plan to guarantee that that happens?
No, it's not his job or my job to do this. How many times do I have to tell you? Our job is to make sure Iran is no longer the largest state sponsor of terrorism, to help the people reconstruct a new government, no boots on the ground. We don't own, you know this idea, you break it, you own it? I don't buy that one bit. It's in America's interest to make sure the Ayatollah is dead. He's dead.
I could be wrong, but it seems like Senator Graham was super hawky, super gleeful about the fact that we are now engaged in military conflict with Iran. And I'm going to back up a little bit to one of the elements of just war, which is how do you win the peace? Life after conflict. And here in this video, Lindsey Graham said, well, it doesn't matter if we have a plan. The important thing is that we're there. But if you go back to what I said at the beginning, all three elements that constitute just war theory are equally important. You can't go into war with a hope and a prayer. There has to be a clear plan for what you're trying to achieve. And if it's regime change, which I don't think is justifiable reason to go to war, there has to be more than hope involved in that regime change. You can't hope that people will suddenly rise up and then hope that suddenly one day there's going to be democracy that flows from the banks of the Euphrates River and all of Iran will be a democracy where all rights are protected, where things are equitable, where things are just, where they too can say that all people are created equal with certain unalienable rights. There has to be a plan to achieve that. And if you look at the United States' efforts at regime change in the past, the most recent past, Afghanistan and Iraq, we can argue that both have failed. In fact, it could be argued that both governments, to a certain degree, are still unstable and are probably worse off than we actually found them. We can definitely say that about Afghanistan. The Taliban is in control again. And then I want to get ready to close this up because, we've been talking about this for a while, and I'm not going to be like a typical Baptist preacher. I know I have my clergy collar on because I am taping this after church service today. Today was the service of the Lord's Supper, the Holy Communion, one of the most important sacraments in the Baptist. Actually, in the Baptist Church, we call it ordinances. So it's one of the two ordinances of the Baptist Church. Exceptionally important. The other ordinance being baptism, if you ever wanted to know what the two ordinances of the Baptist Church are, it's baptism and Holy Communion, or as some people call the Lord's Supper. But I digress. One of the things that we should talk about is, who gets to define what just war is in this case in democracy. And that's why it's important that there be congressional oversight in democracy, because that's the place where the definition of just war is decided, at least in a democratic nation. And then how do we as Christians push back that military action is part of some divine call? For instance, Mike Huckabee, when he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson last week, and Tucker Carlson's a whole nother issue, but on this issue, I'm reluctantly going to agree with his pushback of Mike Huckabee saying that Israel has the right to engage in military action and occupy all of the Middle East because it's been so ordained by God.
You've appealed to Genesis. Genesis 15 says it's Abram, it's pre-Abraham, it's Abram. receives from God the news that his descendants will inherit the land, and you tell me as the theologian if I'm getting this wrong, but from the Euphrates to the Nile. I think that's right. And that would include like basically the entire Middle East. That would be the Levant, so that would be Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. It would also be big parts of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. It would be, I mean...
I'm not sure it would go that far. I mean, it would be a big piece of land, but here's the point.
It would be a lot of places that are now countries.
But this particular area that we're talking about now, Israel, is a land that God gave through Abraham to a people that he chose. It was a people, a place, and a purpose. We can look at it that way. Christian Zionism, I want to go back because that's where we started.
I'm not going to let you off on this because you have said it 3 times that God gave this land to this people. And so it is entirely fair for me with respect to ask, what land are you talking about? Because I just read Genesis 15, as I have many times. And that land, I think it says, from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is, once again, basically the entire Middle East. So God gave that land to his people, the Jews, or he didn't. You're saying he did. What does that mean? Does Israel have the right to that land? Because you're appealing to Genesis. You're saying that's the original deed.
It would be fine if they took it all.
That is more than being theologically problematic. It's theological heresy. War for the Christian should not be a state, in my opinion, that we seek to justify and seek to put God's divine blessing on in any instance. In fact, just war theory does not try to provide divine justification for nation states to go to war, for state-sanctioned violence, but it simply attempts to provide some guidance as to when war might have moral and ethical legitimacy. It does not glorify war. It does not say that war is a state that we should embrace as Christians. It's just an attempt for us as Christians to understand war in a world where we're called to be peacemakers. And there's some other questions that we need to address, and there's room for some pastoral reflection on these things. For instance, how should someone like me, who's a pastor, a minister at a church, a clergy person, discuss war? And this is part of what this episode of the podcast is about, trying to help us understand how we discuss war and how do we discuss our nation involving itself in military action against Iran, and help us to start talking about, is it moral? Is it ethical? Are our rationalizations for or against it theologically sound? What's our role as citizens? Are we to uncritically accept the fact that we're involved in military action in the Middle East? And then, what's the line for the church between pacifism and militarism? Is there a middle place for the church to stake out? Is there any place for the church, God's people, to stake out in this discussion? And then ultimately, can just war theory be relied on to preserve the peace, or does it simply regulate violence? And I think that might ultimately be the question. Does just war provide a means to preserve the peace, or does it simply regulate violence? The father of just war theory, Augustine of Hippo, and St. Thomas Aquinas would both say that the purpose of just war is to preserve the peace. Stanley Hauerwas would say that just war theory no longer has any real substance or meaning because theologians, politicians, Christians, we treat this more as a checklist intended to regulate violence as opposed to force us to engage in significant theological reflection about whether what we're doing will preserve the peace or not, whether it will promote a more just society. At this point in my theological development, I probably lean more on the side of Hauerwas because I feel that so many, especially in this day with Christian nationalism and the like, just war is manipulated and misconstrued in such a way that it's used to actually justify war under any circumstances, to provide theological cover for the regime, no matter what the regime is doing, for the regime to engage in state-sanctioned violence. Thanks for taking time to listen to me and engage in this discussion. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe, like, and share. And until next time, remember to tell the truth, seek justice, and love the people. This is Faithful Witness.